Sorry, I started live and I was just picking up the dog. Okay, so I am back to talk about power and conflict poetry. Rock and roll. So, the first thing you need to just be aware of, this is just for AQA obviously. If you're going to do AQA, you will have to spend about 45 minutes talking about 2 poems. It's important that you compare throughout. That's an important thing. Quite a lot of children just write a paragraph about one, paragraph about the other, and then they put a however or therefore in, or similarly, and they think that's a comparison. You've got to keep referring back to the original poem in your comparison, because otherwise you're not actually consistently comparing. So the first one we're going to talk about is Ozymandias, or Ozymandias, or however the hell you want to say it. I'm not really sure how you say it. I think there are a few things that you could talk about it. I think, well, obviously, first of all, just in terms of what it's about, it is about a guy who's retelling a story that he heard from a traveller. And the traveller says, I was walking along in an old land, it's actually referring to Egypt, an antique land. I was walking along and I saw an old statue, and the statue had fallen apart, and actually all that was left were some legs of stone. There's no trunk, so there's no main body, and a head, and the head's all frowned, and basically on that there's a big pedestal, which is a big thing you stand on to put you above everybody else, that you saw. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So what's important is that there's this sense, which obviously it's a power and conflict, that he believed, Ozymandias as a ruler, he really believed that he was better than everybody else. He put himself on a pedestal, and I just really want to go through some of the obvious things that you might talk about it. So you might want to talk about the fact that power doesn't last forever, and I think that an important part of that is they refer to the decay of the colossal wreck. So you might want to talk about decay, and about that means over time that things fade away and get broken down and of little value, and actually there's something you'd avoid. You might want to talk about wreck being something that used to have a use but no longer does. Some people have said, can I go through AO3? I will mention AO3 as I'm talking about each one. And so we see this idea that actually, despite the fact that Ozymandias at one point had loads of power, that actually nothing remains of that power. And it might be inferred that the reason that nothing lasts from that power is because he wasn't a good leader. We see that he's not a good leader with the phrase cold command. Now, if you're going to talk about alliteration, that's fine, but don't say he uses alliteration to make him seem worse. Well, the alliteration doesn't make him seem worse unless you're going to explain that. So you might want to talk about the harsh sounds of the k in cold command, and that the harsh sounds represent his harsh behaviour. What you don't want to do is just randomly say that he's used alliteration. That will be of no help to anybody and won't get any marks. You might want to talk about his frown and sneer, the idea that he's looking down and that he is laughing at people. There's a nice reference in the text. This is intertextuality. So inter, I-N-T-E-R, textuality. Intertextuality is where you refer to another text. And this, he refers to the Bible in this, where he says, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. So it's the idea that he believes himself to be above Jesus, above God. And he says, look, everyone should look on me, look at what I've done, ye mighty. So look down, God, and see what I've done, and despair. So he's so happy that he's an evil ruler. So you might want to talk about the word despair, that obviously there's a complete lack of happiness, etc. Other things that are important probably is that considering the poet's life, Shelley was excluded from schools, from his school, and it was because he didn't believe in Christianity, actually, and he wrote letters to his to loads of local bishops and said, yeah, just so you know, your God's made up. And he got expelled from university, and as a result he had a bit of a problem with authority, and that's part of, I think, what Ozymandias is about. It's the idea that your authority won't last forever, and if you rule with cold command, your authority won't last forever. There are other ones that you can obviously relate to. It kind of depends what question you get, so at the end what I'll do is I'll go through a few questions. It's important just for your AO3 to recognise that it's written about an Egyptian pharaoh. I think he's called Ramesses, but I'm never really sure how to pronounce that. Ramesses II. And they believed themselves to be God. Or godlike, and obviously he's critical of that sense that you could represent God, and obviously that is a criticism of the church, without a doubt. So I'm going to move on, and we're going to talk about London. So London's like a bit of a depressing poem, but essentially it's about walking through London and just seeing massive poverty and a lack of power. So if you get a question about a lack of power, it's likely that it will be about London, or that your selected poem will be about London. Sorry, the dog's trying to get down. Go on, down you go, pup. So it's likely that you would talk about that. And what he sees, I think it's important to begin with, actually, that he recognises that London is now, it's owned. And he talks about chartered street. So it's something that is listed, something that is regulated, something that is privately owned. And it implies that the Thames itself and the streets are controlled and owned by the people that don't live there. That essentially that you walk through the streets and you look at the Thames, and all of those things are privately owned, and obviously that then conflicts with all of the faces that he meets that are all really unhappy. So if we look at the semantic field, we've got absolutely lovely phrases. We've got the repetition of cry, we've got weakness. We've got, actually cries used several times, we've got sigh. So there's a real semantic field of unhappiness. And what he's recognising is that actually many, many people in London are impoverished and do feel really unhappy and sad. It's set in a time in England when there was massive amounts of poverty. We were also, it's set in England because it's called London, but at the time England was in a huge war with France, and many, many, many people were dying. And he felt that was wrong. He felt that that the world was corrupt and that London was corrupt, and that it was excluding the poor. So kind of like similar, I guess, to an Inspector Calls in that respect. And he felt that was wrong. And so what we see is him start to represent some of those ideas in the poem. He talks about there's this lovely juxtapose of chimney sweepers who are crying. So obviously you can do all of your kind of inferences from crying. And then this juxtapose with the idea of the blackening churches, and the poet William Blake, he really believed that too often religion was used to control people and keep people in their place and keep people down, essentially, and that's why he kind of describes them as blackening. And it's almost like the chimney sweepers, who represent the lower class and people taken advantage of and their poor life, that they are a stain on the church, and the church should be doing something about it, and they're not. Equally, we get this idea of the soldiers sighing. It's alliterative, again, this soft kind of, I guess you could talk about the sibilance there, and about the fact that it kind of represents, the kind of soft acceptance from the poor, or from the taken advantage of, that's how it's going to be. And obviously, you can hear the sigh in Soldier's Sigh because of the sibilance. With this, and you've got the hapless soldier's sigh as runs in blood down palace walls. And again, it's this sense of, it was at the time of the French Revolution, the idea that too many soldiers' lives are lost, and they're lost to make rich the monarchy in their countries, and that isn't okay. So he's critical of that. And then there's a reference to prostitution in this, and I know that's going to make the comments go crazy, but he talks about the youthful harlots, and I mean that should be juxtaposing, but it isn't really, because many prostitutes, harlot is a prostitute, many of them were young, unfortunately, but it's the idea that we've got this harlot who's ended up being made pregnant, and her new baby, her newborn infant, that actually what she feels about it is a curse, because obviously she wouldn't have been able to afford to pay for the baby. So we just get this imagery of really poor people, and it's almost like a listing. We get soldiers who we should feel bad for. We get chimney sweeps who we should feel bad for. Harlots, the prostitutes. And it's important, the repetition of the word every. every cry of every man and every infant's cry of fear in every voice in every ban. So it's the idea that this kind of poverty, this kind of suffering is widespread. So everywhere you go in London, you see this kind of poverty, and he's critical of that, and he thinks that that's not okay, and he uses these quite emotive things, and obviously, he is using emotive language because he's talking about children, he's talking about death, he's talking about blood, he's talking about infants, so all of those kind of people that you end up feeling sorry for, really. And then just the final thing I would talk about is the mind-forged manacles as a metaphor. So a manacle is something, obviously, that it chains you up, keeps you from being free, and it's the idea that people have been told enough that they should believe in a particular religion and that they belong to a particular class, and therefore they are kept in these chains, and that actually that's in the mind, and that if we didn't believe in them, then we might be able to change things. I think that's kind of the obvious idea. I think it's important actually just to mention that during that time that France had overthrown their king and executed him, and that part of that revolution in France was to represent the fact that people should be equal, and that you shouldn't have this hierarchy of monarchy and the people below. And it almost seems like it's written in support of the revolution, the idea that he's asking them to throw off their manacles, their mind-forged manacles. Okay, then we get extract from the prelude or prelude. Lots of people hate this poem. I quite like it. This poem is really like a coming-of-age poem. And it's about a young boy when he's younger, and he starts to do things that are considered sinful. So I'm drinking apple juice here. You see, this is apple juice in a wine glass. It's clearly not wine for anyone that drinks wine. So he steals this boat, and this is like the kind of introduction of his sin. And, because obviously theft is a sin. And then actually what we see is that he is enjoying himself, he feels liberated, he's enjoying nature. And without a doubt, there is this sense that nature is deemed to be powerful and peaceful. We get the description, the present participle, glittering, which again implies reflecting light, which you might relate to religious imagery, that it's beautiful and that it's shining. And it's important to know that William Wordsworth was a romantic poet, and they often wrote about nature and the power of nature. And people have described him as a pantheist as well, which is where he believes that God is in nature. And so that's kind of why we see nature being so powerful, because he believes that it represents... nature represents the voice of God. And what we see is this list of sins beginning at the start of the poem. So he steals the boat for a start, and then he's proud of himself, and pride is obviously deemed to be a sin. And then we get this quite sexualized imagery, which always feels awkward to talk about, but it says, you can read between the lines, I don't need to talk about this massively, but lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake. So, and then brilliantly that's followed by, and as I rose upon the stroke. So you can infer what you like from rose and lustily and dipping your oar, but essentially what we're seeing is this coming of age. This is for AQA, for that person that just asked. This coming of age, he's stolen something that he shouldn't have. He's gone off on his own. He's feeling proud. It's this kind of delving into sin. And actually, what happens is that nature rebels against that and says that basically that it's not okay without speaking. So we get this mountain in the back, and it is personified. And the reason it's personified, of course, is because it's supposed to be representative of God and God's voice. So it says a huge peak, black and huge. So again, this repetition of huge. It was so big, it was insurmountable, it was intimidating, it was godlike. So it's black and huge, and obviously you can infer from the word black and how frightening that might be, and some of the symbolism there. This huge peak, black and huge, and then it talks about it, and it says upreared its head. So it's like nature's seen what he's doing and is trying to teach him a lesson, and starts to rise up, and he feels as if nature is chasing after him and he's frightened. So if you get a question about the power of nature, you would want to talk, you'd want to talk about the fact that nature is teaching him a lesson here. You'd want to talk about huge peak, black and huge. You want to talk about it being representative of his pantheist values and beliefs that nature represents God. And he runs away, essentially. He steals through the water, and he returns the boat back to where he found it, which of course in itself has taught him a lesson. But what's important is that he's left with this lesson. Nature has changed him. He says that there hung a darkness, that it's haunted him. He's reflecting on the conflict in his mind, really, because he sees that nature can be at once peaceful and beautiful, but that if you commit sin or whatever, that it's also something to be really afraid of. This is part, because it's called Extract from the Prelude, this is part of a wider poem, and it's all about a man growing up and about spiritual and moral development. So Prelude was the first part of that poem, so it's important that you talk about that as a wider thing. If you want to get higher marks, really, you need to be talking about the symbolism in this poem. So you'd want to be talking about the fact that it's about a spiritual journey, that it's about coming of age. You might want to talk about the way that it's structured and the fact that it begins with this really peaceful sense of nature, and then there's a clear critical change from nature being beautiful, him doing sin, into this kind of almost punishment, this power of nature section. Okay, so then we move on to My Last Duchess. You've got to remember quotes, yeah? So I think the most obvious thing to be doing is, obviously, you could use the titles, because they're pretty easy to remember, and of course you all have a list of the titles as well. So any kind of AO2 connotations you can get from that makes sense. My Last Duchess is about a guy. He is obviously a duke, and he is showing someone his paintings, and he's showing this guy his paintings, and the guy's actually come to find out whether or not he should negotiate the kind of wedding agreements for a new wife. And he says, oh, okay, let me show you this painting. I'm going to draw back the curtain. This is my old wife, my last Duchess. I really liked her, but she was difficult to deal with. She was what does he say? She was how should I say? In fact, that's exactly what he says. Too soon made glad. So he felt jealous, basically. He felt really jealous of the fact that she was too easily made glad, and she blushed at people, and he didn't like that. He felt jealous because he's used to having power, because obviously he's a duke, and he didn't quite know how to approach it with her, and he felt like if he did approach it with her, he'd be lowering himself. So he gave commands. Notice that he uses the verb gave as if it's a gift, but he gave commands, and basically that is him saying that she should be killed. He gets her killed, and then he carries on and says, okay, anyway, yes, so this woman used to be my wife. She was too happily made happy around other people, so I got her killed. Anyway, moving on. Do you want to look at this this statue made of bronze? Some people argue that that there's this statue, Neptune, is him believing that he's godlike. And that's absolutely fine as an interpretation. And if you're going to talk about that, there's a really nice link to Ozymandias with the King of Kings. This idea that he has so much power that he really believes that he's godlike. The other thing I think is important is we're talking about the structure. So if you're going to talk about the structure, say for this one and then Ozymandias, you might want to talk about Ozymandias is in a sonnet, and this idea that it's a really controlled structure. So you should know the rules of a sonnet, and if you don't, look it up. But essentially, because he adheres to those rules and holds tight those rules, that it's kind of reflective of the control that Ozymandias had and his power. And in this particular one, also, we get this really long narrative poem where he's talking at somebody and they don't reply. And you could argue that that the fact that it's one long section shows his amount of control. The other thing that's worth noting, actually, is the fact that it's written in rhyming couplets, and that in itself implies that it's almost rehearsed, that he's said this many a time, perhaps, or that he's really spent a lot of time thinking about it. One of my students came up with a lovely analysis in theirs, and they talked about power in this, and of course he has power. So he has power because he says, I gave commands, and he happily killed her, essentially. But I think what's important is that at first he felt disempowered, and he felt disempowered because he said, she thanked men, good, but she thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-year-old name with anybody's gift. So he feels that he should be empowered because he's got a 900-year-old name. And yet he doesn't feel empowered because he feels that she is happy to talk to anybody else. If it's buffering, I'm sorry, again it's saying it's got a bad connection.
I'm not using the internet.
So, yeah, we get the sense that he feels that he should have power because he is a duke, and he's got this 900-year-old name. You know, it's his name, but the dukedom. And yet, at the end, does he really have power? Because essentially, he stood in front of a curtain, saying he's the only person allowed to reveal this inanimate object. He's so obsessed by this woman, and in fact so disempowered by her seeming disinterest, or interest in other things, that he spends his time trying to protect an inanimate object. I think that they're the kind of obvious things. The only other thing is that if you talk about the Neptune thing at the end, when he says, "Oh, notice Neptune," though, and talks about a different piece of artwork, it is important to notice how quickly he just changes the subject, as if he's forgotten about his dead wife and he's flippantly moved on. And you could argue that that shows that he is a little bit insane, because he's just admitted to killing her, even though he's trying to get married with a new person. So in terms of language you might want to analyse there, you definitely talk about Neptune. I would talk about the commands. I would probably talk about the 900-year-old name. I'd probably talk about my as well, because of how possessive it is. Browning, the poet himself, I like some of his work, and he married Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who I really, really liked as well. But they had both struggled with their families because they had felt like they were really controlled. So I wonder if part of the reason of the poem is the idea of family controlling you, and he certainly felt that. Certainly Barrett Browning, that's his wife's Elizabeth Barrett Browning's life had been controlled by her father, and that he was overprotective. And there's this kind of relationship there in the poem that's also about someone being overprotective. It is also worth noting that it is based on a real duke. Again, I'm not really sure how you say his name. Ferrara, maybe. It's Ferrara. And obviously it's written from his perspective. It's a first-person narrative poem. But we know that he actually did marry somebody really very, very young, and she died, although there is no evidence whatsoever that he killed her. But the idea that he married someone who was younger and more vulnerable and could take advantage. If you want to use the proper term for the poem, so I just said it's a first-person narrative poem, you would call it a dramatic monologue, is if you're aiming for those higher marks. And let's move on to Chargeable Light Brigade. I'm not a massive fan of this poem, really. So just so you know, it talks about half a league. A league is like a measurement, so it's about 3 miles, basically. So half a league would be, what, like 1.5 miles. Basically, it's about people who get charged. So there was a brigade called the Light Brigade, and they got told that they should charge at particular people. And basically, what happened? They're on their horses, and loads of them died. Is basically what happened. And it's a sad story. But I think this is, in many respects, by Tennyson, is an anti-war poem. And I think that what's important about it really is the idea that people were sent to death irresponsibly, and that they should never have been sent to death. Because actually, if the person making the commands had really thought it through, they would have known that those people shouldn't have done that. And actually, it was a miscommunication that sent the Light Brigade charging ahead, and loads and loads of people died. But what it did is it showed the British Army, and indeed the British people, that mistakes can happen. And these men, obviously, they'd followed the orders blindly, and so in many respects, it's kind of a criticism of how that works. So they they followed these orders, and yet they shouldn't. And it's kind of interesting because Tennyson was asked to write about it. He was asked to write about their glorious sacrifice, but you can't help but see a little bit that he is writing about their sacrifice, and he almost like seems to celebrate them. But again, there's this sense of he's being critical as well. Without a doubt, he's being critical because it implies that like it was just a massive mistake and it was an error. Some people talk about that many of the words end in ERED, the erd, and I think someone just wrote about that, although I'm not sure. The idea that that shows the error, that it repeats this idea of an error. So if you want to talk about some of the things, I don't know. So the repetition of cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. The idea that there were so many guns that they never had any chance. Lots of people are talking about the meter, and I think that's fine, but I think it's quite complicated to explain without any kind of visuals. So I'm not gonna really talk about that right now. And also, I think you could talk about it, but it isn't necessary to get a good mark. So we've got repetition of canon, and we get it again in the 5th stanza. So this repetition, this anaphora of canon to canon, where the start of a sentence or clause is repeatedly done with the same thing, represents just the number of cannons that they had to fight. And essentially what that does is it serves to highlight what a mistake it was. We also, I mean, there's so many words in here that represent how violent it was. We get this nice sibilance with sabre stroke, shattered, sundered. The idea that almost mimics how quickly the swords were moving. It creates this sense of the swing in the air, and you could absolutely talk about that. But he feels that these people are heroes, and it's important because he ends with a rhetorical question. It's designed in a way to persuade you to respect these people. When can their glory fade? As in that it should never fade. What they've done is amazing, and you see all these exclamation marks in the last stanza. He says, and he gives the imperative verb, honour the Light Brigade. It's your moral duty to honour them because they made a sacrifice for you. And then again he repeats the noble 600, but of course 600 didn't return. Exposure, this is probably my favourite, one of my favourites. Exposure, I actually studied at GCSE as well, so it's been on the spec for quite some time. This is about World War One. It's written by Wilfred Owen, who really depressingly died 4 days before the end of World War One. Owen had been injured in World War One, had gone off to recuperate, and then got sent back to the front. So he'd seen some really bad bits of war, and I think that one of the things that he felt was that people were being deceived into going to war, and that they were being killed by things like the weather when that wasn't necessary. And he's saying, come on, there is no reason that our soldiers should be freezing to death. And that actually, I think that when people think of war, particularly World War One, they think of the trenches and going over the top and lots of fighting and bombs and gas actually as well. And he's saying, it's quieter than that, it's calmer than that. And actually, the problem is that we were killed by rain, we were killed by snow, and he's critical of the government because he thinks something should happen. So I guess the first thing to talk about is the title, Exposure. It's partly about exposure to the weather. It's partly about exposing the truth and exposing the public to what was happening. Then we start to see this personification of the weather. So we get the iced east winds that knive us. Knife is the personification of the wind, obviously, and again, it's this sense of violence, all of the kind of things that you would associate with a war, but actually it's the weather that's doing that. Knife something that can kill you, obviously, something that isn't got full of intent, that it's sharp, that it's cold, and that obviously describes the weather, and that he also describes them as merciless. So it's interesting because you get this semantic field of war and violence, but actually it seems to be very much the weather that is causing the problem. And he's critical of the fact that basically they didn't get enough funding to sort those kind of things out. He also talks about mad gusts tugging on the wire, and I think that the mad gusts is reflective of the wind, obviously, because there's crazy gusts that's coming and going, but also the idea that this war in itself is madness, the people sending them are madness, the orders are madness. We get this, somewhere there's lovely sibilance about the sudden successive bullets, and I can't find it. Oh, there we go. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Again, this sibilance that is used to create an atmosphere of war. It sounds as if the bullets are flying through the air. But there's very, very little actual violence in there. There's the bullets, and there are these far-off bombs, but what we really see that is the killer is the snow and the cold. It talks about, and he says, sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. So you might want to talk about the imagery there, and the fact that they use black, which is obviously symbolic of death and mourning. So I think what Owen really wanted to do is he was critical of the war, and he was critical of the causes of the war, and why we were fighting. And he started to potentially lose faith there. But he also, I think, was kind of saying the people who are sending us to war, they can't be religious, which is part of why I think he says for love of God seems dying. And I think the end that is important really is where he talks about the burying party, and that they pause over half-known faces. And I think it's important that they just pause, because the pause is really short, and it implies that they haven't really got time. They're busy, their lives, they matter, but they don't really matter because so many people are dying. And actually, those faces are only half known. And I think this juxtaposing of all their eyes are ice, the idea that eyes are where you're supposed to look into someone's soul and see their life and get to know them, and actually it's ice, I think... I don't know if there's anything really massively more to say about that. It's definitely deliberately an atmospheric poem where the alliteration and the sibilance is used a lot to create this sense of atmosphere and the weather being everywhere and all around you. I think that But Nothing Happens is clearly... literally, it's just about the fact that things don't change, and that many people were just dying because of the weather, and that actually a lot of the war was about waiting. But really, the nothing happens is a criticism of the government, that they don't do anything to change it. People are dying. Their own men are dying of the cold, and they're not doing anything about it. The obvious one, if you get the power of the weather to talk about, would be that one. But of course, you could talk about Storm on the Island. The first thing to notice about Storm on the Island is it's written by an Irish poet. You've got to understand the Irish conflict. I just don't know how you can possibly do the Irish conflict justice in like a matter of seconds. But essentially, Ireland was one country. England invaded it. There was a big war, and essentially one of the Irish government officials agreed that they would separate Ireland, and we would take the six, England, would take the six northern, I want to say counties, and they split Ireland in half, and then lots of the Catholics were then forced to be in Southern Ireland, and lots of the Protestants were in Northern Ireland, and essentially there was a big, long conflict. This has been going on for a really, really long time, and I think that there are wrongs that have been done on both sides, but essentially, England invaded their country and took part of it away, and then there's been a conflict ever since now, and the Parliament name appears in the title of the poem. So Stormont, Stormont, is the name of their government area, their government, I can't think of the word. Anyway, it's a reference to the Irish government, and as a result, you see that this poem, although it's literally about a storm, it's metaphorically about the troubles in Ireland. And what's notable in it really is that they talk about, he talks about being prepared. So, but what's nice is that the first word we get there is we, this sense of unity, this sense of a community being together. So although war is pulling people apart, they do have a sense that they are together and that they can save themselves from this thing. And we get this imagery really of people coming in and attacking an area where they live. So the imagery we get is of violence, definitely. So you get pummels is a really lovely example, and that would and the chorus in a gale. This idea that the weather is assaulting them, but of course the weather is a metaphor for the violence that we saw in the Irish conflict. Again, you get this nice oxymoron, exploding comfortably. So obviously, comfortably implies that it's easy, that it doesn't cause any problem, and exploding is violent and aggressive and causes damage and death. And that's to discuss the sea and the influence of the weather on the sea. But of course, what it's really doing is talking about how many people used bombs, and that you almost got to a point particularly in the Northern Ireland border, where you were used to bombs going off and used to attacks. And he talks about that at the end, that it's strange that it's a huge nothing that we fear, and it's interesting that he talks about that, because obviously literally he's talking about the weather, that you're frightened of the weather, you're frightened of the wind, but really he's kind of saying this idea of religion and this idea of land and which country belongs to who, that in a way it's a nothing. Like, it shouldn't matter enough to take lives, and it shouldn't matter enough to turn people savage. So he happily uses metaphors throughout, basically, to talk about the Irish conflict. And maybe that's because talking about the Irish conflict is quite a difficult thing, and so he does it metaphorically to make people understand it and see it in a different light. You do probably want to talk about the idea of the cottage or the house that he's in representing his safety, and the idea that what has been built, the homes, they represent a safety and this sense of that home can protect you, certainly from the weather and obviously from the conflict. So we move on then to Bayonet Charge. Hang on 1 second.
A minor note about Ireland. Ireland joined the United Kingdom in 1801, but the split didn't happen until 1920.
There you are. So 1801, sorry, say that again.
The term United Kingdom...
Connor is giving us a little history lesson here. So the term United Kingdom...
became official in 1801.
When
the Parliaments of Britain and Ireland each passed an Act of Union.
So there was an Act of Union between the Parliaments. However...
uniting the two kingdoms, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And it wasn't until the 1920s...
In the 1920s, obviously, that's when the conflict happened.
It was intended to create two self-governing territories within Ireland.
Yeah.
Both remaining within the United Kingdom, but that didn't work out so well.
Yeah, it didn't go so well. I mean, there are people now, even now, really struggling with the Northern Ireland divide. And, with Brexit, there's a real worry about the border. There's been loads of conflict at the border, and it's a really difficult one. So then we've got Bayonet Charge. Bayonet Charge is this kind of... it's a war poem. And it begins in quite an ambiguous tone. So he talks about suddenly he awoke. And you don't know if awake means that he's had a dream and then he wakes up... No, sorry, he's asleep and he wakes up remembering something, or whether or not... he suddenly awoke is actually representative of him realising the truth and realising that this is what's got to happen. This is a great poem to talk about if you're going to talk about the realities of war. There's such lovely phrases about war. Give me 1 second. It's the pup. Okay, so we've got just lovely vocabulary here. So they describe him as being raw. Raw being something that you might associate with flesh, with vulnerable. I don't know, there's something horrible about the word raw. And we get just this sense of like craziness and confusion, that war just isn't what it should be. So if you're going to compare that to like exposure, he's saying that war is mad and unexpected, the mad gus tugging on the wire. And in this one, he talks about being dazzled with rifle fire and bullets smacking the belly out of the air and stumbling across a field. So all of the verbs he uses, so stumbling being the present participle, smacking being the present participle, and dazzled being the past participle, all of those ones that he uses kind of go, it's full of confusion and lots of action happening, and he's just not really sure what is supposed to be going on. I think we get, it's interesting as well, because we get this lovely rural image, and then it's contrasted with the violence, the horrible violence of his... this horrible violence of the actual war, and this really human feeling, because he's raw, he's sweating, and he's numb. They talk about smashed arm. Obviously, there's this undertone that you could get hurt with this smashed arm there. They talk about the patriotic tear that's brimming in his eye, and they talk about it, and they refer to it as molten, and obviously molten iron. And it's almost like they're kind of referring to him as a machine, like he is like almost crying. So we see this vulnerability of this soldier with this patriotic tear, but they describe it as iron, and it's almost like he's being referred to as almost a tank or something, but it definitely dehumanises him. It's interesting then, this reference to cold clockwork. Now again, if you're going to talk about the alliteration, you need to talk about the fact that it's harsh, and obviously you've got that harsh sounding C. This again is critical of war. So he's saying, like, how is it in these countries, the cold clockwork, so just the general workings, how is it that I've ended up being in, or that this guy, he has ended up being in that particular moment, in that particular second? How have we ended up in a position where this is okay, where a man is running and that he doesn't know what's going to happen to him, and that he's potentially going to kill people or be killed? And so there's this real sense of uncertainty there. And definitely cold clockwork represents that harshness, and the clockwork of the fact that it's kind of inevitable that it will carry on and that it will be forever. But also there's almost a sense of it being trivialised, because it's kind of like a toy soldier game between nations rather than a real one. Oh wow. Someone's just come in and bought me flowers. Oh. How cute is that? So the theme in the poem basically is about the war being really horrible, about so many people getting taken advantage of with war, and that actually they end up being taken advantage of, and it's this cold clockwork that makes them do these things, a bit like in Chargeable Light Brigade. All right, Saucy, it's all right. I think there are so many things that you can talk about. I definitely think that the plunging and the bewilderment, and it's all right, Saucy. That's the dog, and the stumbling, all really important. This idea that they're just not really sure what's going on. I think that there's this lovely aside here with king, honour, human dignity, etc. Etc. is important because it lists them, the key reasons that you might go to war, the key things that you think are important: king, honour, human dignity. And yet he then makes it sound flippant by using etc. as if, and many other things. And he says they're dropped like luxuries, that essentially human dignity in a war does not exist, and that is exactly the same as exposure, and I guess in many respects it's the same as in the Chargeable Light Brigade. I guess this is by Ted Hughes. I'm not sure if that's massively relevant, because he didn't serve obviously in World War One, but he was an RAF serviceman, and so he did focus on war, and he did see kind of the impact of conflict on people, and so in many respects he wasn't anti-war, but he was critical of some of the decisions that had been made. And I'd also think, just as an aside, it is important that it's a nameless soldier, that it could be any soldier, it could be anyone, that many people were left in that situation. and I guess the other thing that's just worth noting is that that you get a sense that he's made to feel or seem like an animal, that he's running away, because they talk about him running at the green, or by the green hedge, or to the green hedge, sorry, and there's this kind of yellow hair, as in, like a rabbit, but bigger. So there's this sense of connection between man and nature, but also the sense that he's almost not like a man. He's treated almost like an animal, like an afraid animal. I think that's pretty much it. So then we're on to Remains. This will be the one that you will find easy. It's part of me feels like Remains is going to come up in the exam, because I feel like for a first spec it might be quite nice to talk about something that's relatively easy, or easier than some of the others. However, Saucy, come here. Sorry, the dog's trying to eat my flowers now. But then I also think maybe if they put one of the harder ones as a text, then maybe that would be easier, because it's easier for you to do AO2 connotations from a poem that's in front of you. Anyway, Remains. So Simon Armitage was, he met loads of real soldiers, and this is based on a real soldier's story, and basically he spoke to them, and the reason that it's done in this anecdotal, colloquial language is because, one, it's designed to be matter of fact, that these are the real facts of war, but also because it's supposed to represent his voice, this man's voice, because it was a real interview. And this sense that it comes in almost in the middle of the action, this and on another occasion, which implies that there were occasions before and indeed occasions after where he did things that were similarly unpalatable. Again, you could argue that this is an anti-war poem. So basically they kill this looter, and what's important is that he says probably armed, possibly not, and that then it brings up kind of the idea of power, the fact that he had the power to kill that man, and he may well not have had a gun on him, and in the sense that in the moment you might make mistakes. So that's links obviously to Chargeable Light Brigade and Bayonet Charge perhaps, and his doubt. He's not sure whether or not they did he did have a gun, and therefore he may have shot a man in the back who didn't have a gun. And obviously that's part of the reason he starts to feel guilty, and that's repeated, and we know that's important. He says, well, myself and somebody else and somebody else. So basically, again, these anonymous soldiers, they all do the same thing, and they shoot this guy. There are a few nice bits of language here that you could talk about. So the first one, I see every round as it rips through his life. So the idea that the use of the verb rip is important. So, and they say it doesn't rip through his body, it doesn't tear his body. It rips, it completely pulls apart. It rips through, and they talk about his life, so that it's actually it's more symbolic than just his body, his physical body. It's like everything that he represents, his personality, and of course it will lead to his death. And then there's a really graphic image of this looter. He is utterly dehumanised, because they say he's sort of inside out. And inside out is something that you might talk about with regards to trousers or something like that, or a top. It's certainly not something that you would expect from a human being. So it's a really graphic image. And then this is coupled with the verb tosses. So he gets the guts and he tosses them back into the guy's body. This shows a real lack of care, and also an abuse of power, because not only have they shot a man in the back who they weren't sure whether or not would have been armed or not, but then they tossed the guts back in his body, and they used another verb, carted off as well. And it's interesting as well that when he's talking about something so serious, that he still continues to use colloquialisms. So he refers to one of my mates goes back, and it's kind of like there's almost a lack of care. And you could argue that actually maybe the reason he talks about them like that is because he can't talk about it any other way, because otherwise he'd have to face the reality of what he did, and so he uses these kind of colloquialisms to make himself feel better. And then he says, well, end of story, done. But not really. And that half rhyme, that sense of it's complete but it's not complete, is designed to exemplify that, but also that naturally something follows. End of story, except not really. that something of course will follow from, and he talks about his blood shadow being on the street, that basically you can't escape these things. So when you've killed a human being, that you can walk away, but essentially that, like a bit like Lady Macbeth really, the blood will remain on your hands. And you get this nice enjambment when he says, "But I blink," and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. The idea, "but I blink," so it's every time he closes his eyes, he sees this guy. And so if we're talking about the effects of war, or the effects of conflict, which very much could come up as a question, he's affected. He cannot escape it. It's there repeatedly. It's always there for him. He's haunted by war. The effect of war for him is that he will be racked with guilt. And of course he had the power, and now he's powerless. So I guess you could compare that to Ozymandias, but I think their poems are so different that I wouldn't really recommend that. But the idea that power can be lost, and this guy who was so unimportant, he was just a looter, again has no name, but he's in the guy's head when he closes his eyes, so he's become important. And we get this sense of importance of place. So he says, "Not left for dead in some distant sand-smothered land." This sibilance again creates this kind of sound, which is in this context quite sinister. It's almost like this kind of dreaming, sinister state. So that's the dog squeezing his toy, and then he's basically saying he's there always, that he's here and now. His bloody life in my bloody hands. Again, bloody sounds like a colloquialism, but it's this repetition of blood, and it's kind of like the idea that metaphorically the blood is still there on the man's hands, that although he's gone, he's long gone, that his blood will remain there. It's worth looking up post-traumatic stress disorder, actually, if you are going to write about this poem, you don't know what that means, but PTSD. So if you can't think of how to spell that, so PTSD. Because clearly this guy's got it. He's haunted by the war, and it was a real soldier who was in, I think, Iraq, and it's supposed to be a real story. And Simon Armitage interviewed him. And actually, if you look on YouTube after this, you can see that there's a real video of the guy talking, and so many of the phrases are exactly what he says. I think it might be worth, if you're just going to talk about the structure, the enjambment you could talk about, and you could talk about the caesura. Basically, they serve to emphasise this kind of the natural speaking pattern, this colloquial tone, and the realism. It makes him a real character, a real voice. But he does appear to be almost like desensitised or numb. He's clearly haunted, and he can talk about it, but the way that he talks about, he's clearly haunted because he talks about his bloody life and his bloody hand, but he the way he talks about tossing the guts back inside of him, it shows that he's desensitised to war without a doubt. Then we move on to Poppies. It's interesting actually because this poem is fictional. It's not about, it's based on a woman who doesn't really have a son who goes to war. You could assume that it's a boy, but you don't necessarily know, but it implies that it's a boy. And it's a woman who, her son has gone to war, and she's remembering him leaving, and she's concerned about it, because obviously, I imagine if you're a mother and you send your son off to war, you must spend an awful lot of time, do my thing, I love you, you must spend an awful lot of time worrying about what's happening to them. And so we see this, everything that she's interacting with him, everything that she interacts with him or remembers from him is linked to war. So she's talking about spasms of red paper, she's talking about the poppy being on his blazer, and it's disrupting the blockade of the yellow bias. So you've got these kind of lines down a blazer, and the idea that she uses the word blockade to describe it kind of implies that in everything she sees war, in everything she sees the violence and the realities of war, because that's what she feels. Because when she looks at her son, she doesn't see a guy who's going off to do his job. She sees somebody who might get injured or killed in war. And again, that's in the imagery of, she's talking about having cat hair, when you've got cat hairs on your clothing, because cats molt. She's wrapped sellotape around her own hand, and she's pushed it across his outfit to try and get all of the cat hairs off. But she talks about it being bandaged around her hand. So again, there's this sense of fear that he's going to be injured. That that semantic field is deliberate. She's using it a semantic field of injury because she's concerned that her son will be injured. This fictional character, and we get a really lovely sense of her reflecting on the memories of him. She's smoothing down his collar. She's doing all the kind of classic mother things. And she says, I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, a play at being Eskimos, like we did when you were little. So, I don't know if people did this with their parents when they're little, but like you wiggle nose and you call it Eskimo kisses. So she's remembering him being a tiny little child. And obviously that's done to make it more emotive, to understand the kind of the feeling of loss that she has, and this juxtaposed between him being a soldier now and being absent, and him being a soldier and her, being a tiny child. So obviously that's what he used to be. The fact that he's then grown up is referring, like the fact that he's gelled his hair, and she compares them to blackthorns, which are hook on your skin and cause injury. So again, there's this sense of injury, always undertone, and it's almost like although she's at home, she's far away from the war. She's been injured by the war, but she's been injured emotionally. We get this nice sibilance again, smooth down your shirt's upturned collar, still the softening. So again, this softness, this sense of the calm tone of that scene, this loving, soft tone. And she tries to be brave, and it's funny that she talks about herself being brave, because also she's talking about herself being brave, but she's not going to war, but it's because losing her son is such an extreme thing for her to have to do, that she feels that she needs to respond to it with bravery. And of course, because she's the parent, she feels that she has to protect him and look after him. And then he's gone, and she describes it as being like releasing a songbird from its cage, which obviously is a metaphor, and it's like he is this beautiful creature and he needs to be set free. But of course the problem is that if you have a caged bird, a singing bird, and you let them free, they die, because they're not used to being, it's like leaving a caged animal into the wild. They can't defend for themselves. So this idea that, she's letting this songbird who's beautiful out of the cage of home, but she's terrified that he's going to die and that he won't survive. And of course, because he's at war. She then goes to a church, so you've got this religious imagery, which you could, if you wanted, link to exposure and for love of God seems dying. And she looks around all of these war memorials, and I guess it's that kind of fear that it may well be him. She's got all these jumbled emotions. She's walked along, she's looking at these war memorials, they're making her feel afraid. And essentially, again, this is about the effects of war, but it's about the effects of war on a wider community, not just this the people that are actually in war, but all of the people around them. And she definitely feels this clear sadness that he's left, and fear, but also a clear pride. You might get something about family relationships, in which case you would probably want to compare that poem to Kamikaze, because Kamikaze is about war, pulling families apart, but in a very, very different way. God, how many have we got left to fly? I've been going on for ages. We've got War Photographer now by Caroline Duffy. Caroline Duffy, she actually commissioned Poppies to be written when she was the Poet Laureate, and she wanted people to write poems about war, because she's struggling with understanding modern warfare and why we're doing it. And this is actually a true story about one of her friends who went across to many, many places, and his job was to take pictures of wars. And so I think, firstly, the image of the dark room. If you don't understand how old cameras have developed, before digital cameras, it would take onto a film, you'd have to go into a room that was completely black with only a red light. in order to develop the photos. That's how it worked. But she uses this imagery of the red light, and obviously red being symbolic of death and blood and those things, and the fact that it's a dark room, again, this kind of solitude, loneliness, the imagery of darkness. And what's nice is that there's quite there's like this this imagery of this kind of almost it's kind of almost womb-like, this dark kind of red safe place that it was softly glowing. But then they use this this language of the church. So it's this sense that when you come back from a war thing, that almost brings you back to God and makes you reflect on God, because he's like a priest preparing a mass. And it's interesting because then they list this. They list all the places that he's been that have had conflict, and then they briefly talk about this, or she briefly refers to a metaphor, and she says all flesh is grass, and it's this sense that life is fragile and flesh will eventually decompose into grass, but it's almost like it's meaningless, that it will just carry on and will disappear. And then it flips very suddenly to something really quite like abrupt. He has a job to do. And that it uses the sibilants to represent the slopping solutions in the tray. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, they seem to now. So the idea that he's haunted by war, so obviously that links to remains. Trembling hands, so it says tremble. And again, you could talk about place. So we've got rural England, the fact that actually he's home, and that people who are miserable in England can be happy just because there's nice weather. But actually, this contrast then is with this nightmare place, and he calls it nightmare heat, and he talks about fields that explode beneath the feet of running children, and deliberately they've used the image of a child because children are vulnerable, they represent the future, they represent innocence and all those things. And then it says something is happening. That's meant to be symbolic of a wider thing happening, the idea of war, the idea of realisation and those things, but it's also that the photo's developing, and he remembers a woman crying and crying and crying as her husband dies, and he's trying to take a photograph of it. And then it basically, he talks about 100 agonies, or she talks about, because it's Karen Duffy, 100 agonies in black and white, and basically that he's taken so many photographs of this war and it's just awful, and yet only 5 or 6 will end up on Sunday's papers, and that actually people don't know the full picture, that being a war photographer, although you've got a job to do, in a way it's futile, and you should feel, or he feels guilty because he's seen all these agonies and is only able to share a few, and that what's worse about it is that people don't care. That you read it, you briefly feel sad, your eyeballs prick, as in like they start with a few tears, and then they carry on, and they have a bath, before bath, and they have a bath, and then they read the paper and they see it, they feel briefly sad, and then they go for a beer. And that's true, like people do see that stuff and then feel briefly bad and then carry on. And he basically says, they do not care. And that's the or she says, but through the he, people see these war images and they do not care, and they should. And so she's then trying to use her language to make people care, to make people understand that war affects many, many people. And it's not just the people who die, it's the war photographers, and it's many others, and the wives of the people that die. In terms of getting kind of like the higher marks or trying to do that, I think you could talk about the sense of order in the poem, that it clearly goes through each part of the solution slopping the trays, and him being in the dark room, the solutions, the idea of the processing, that it's this clear precision of the job, and that obviously massively contrasts with the chaos that he's been photographing. Then we get to everyone's favourite, tissue. What's tissue even about? So tissue is about the idea that the world is made up of very clear set boundaries of concrete and paper and records, and that actually we should just be a bit more transparent, we should be a bit more flexible, we should be a bit more free. That's essentially what it's about. And that tissue, because it's so transparent, it lets the light through, which is what she says, paper that lets the light through, or shine through. And that's obviously about hope. It's also about religious imagery. It lets in things, that it makes the world more transparent. And she then talks about the things that hold us, the institutions essentially that take away our power. So the institutions she refers to are religion. She does that through the Quran. She talks about record books and histories. She talks about maps. She talks about bills and credit card slips and receipts. And essentially what she's saying is all of those things hold us in confines. They have power over us, and they should just be a bit more flexible. They should be a bit more flexible. That these, she says, fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. The idea that we are dragged or guided by these pieces of paper, that money essentially, and that we needn't be, and that perhaps if we changed our approach to owning things and materialism, that maybe we would regain this kind of really childlike image that we get of paper kites. Obviously is linked to childhood. I'm just going to turn the light on. Just give me 1 second. Talk. I return with the pop. Hello. So people are getting really stressed out about tissue, and there is no reason to. Essentially, if you get a question about power or about being controlled, then really you just want to talk about the idea that that money and the institutions, they control things, and that she thinks they should be more flexible, they should be more like tissue, that they should let the light in, be transparent as in open and honest, that they should be more linked to God and more kind and hopeful. Essentially that's what she's saying. And maps, for example, where they've got all the lines between countries, that they are artificial, and that actually we should just see them almost with the light shining through, that actually place is just it doesn't need to be drawn into this country and this country and this place and this place, that it should be more transparent, and that sun should just shine through those. We should just celebrate those places rather than focus on separating them out. In terms of her, it is important to understand that she looks at loads of issues like religion and politics and immigration. So she is Pakistani, but she was raised in Glasgow in Wales, so she's kind of Welsh, kind of Pakistani, and then brilliantly married an Indian who anyone that knows a bit of history will understand that India and Pakistan have had quite a lot of conflict in the past, and Pakistan's a Muslim country, and India, it's a mix of religions actually, but she thinks that things just shouldn't be quite so hard-lined, so like paper. They should be more like tissue. And obviously she then links in tissue to human flesh, and she's saying that would make it it would be more human. So if things were a bit more transparent, a bit more flexible, then they would be more human as well. Then we've got the Imagery. Oh my God, how many have we got left? Imagery, and then that one, and then that one. Oh my God, there's loads. I think we've got 3 more to go. I'm really sorry, this feels really long. When we do checking out my history, I've got very little to say. I'm not a fan. I don't dislike it, I think it's hard to write about in this context. So the Imagery, she is essentially an immigrant. Imagery is the female form, and she's had to leave her country. She talks really beautifully about her country. She misses it, she loves it. She refers to it, her memories of it, sunlight clear. But unfortunately, there's been a conflict in her country and she's had to leave it. And she talks about it being sick with tyrants. Now, she personifies her city. She feels that it's important, it's a relevant part of her history. She feels that it's part of her character. It is a character to her. She feels as if it is alive. It's important to her. And yet she is been taken away from it because of this conflict, and And what's sad about it is that we get this sense that she's always trying to find out about her city. She talks about watching the news or the worst news. She talks about being told things. So this city is forever in her mind. Her home is forever in her mind. It's like if you imagine being taken away from what you love and then just being put somewhere else. And she misses it. And it's nice because I think too often people talk about immigrants as if, they've chosen to leave a particular place. And actually, many of the refugees that we're seeing now, that they haven't wanted to leave their home and they mourn for their home, they miss their home. Like if I was suddenly taken away, I would just feel like I'd miss so much about England if I wasn't free to travel here again. And she talks about the white streets of that city. Now, white obviously is about innocence and purity and hope and beauty. It's unscathed, even though it's sick with tyrants. And she talks about being a child there and about learning language there. And actually now that it's very difficult because her language is obviously different in the country that she's travelled to. And we do get some imagery here of quite warlike image. So we talk about frontiers rising. And then what else do we get? She talks about her language feeling like sunlight to her. And again, you could talk about that as kind of hope and beauty and etc. etc. And what's important is that, in a way, she kind of feels unwelcome where she is. So she feels that she spends time with her city in her mind, perhaps. And she describes it again as a person. It's docile as paper. Now, the fact that she described it as docile as paper is something you could clearly link to tissue. But she talks about it really affectionately, and she talks about combing its hair and loving its shining eyes, being bright and beautiful. And she talks about her city taking her dancing. And again, there's this sense of celebration and joy and energy and life in her city. Dancing is a nice word to remember if you don't remember anything else about the poem. And but then she says that she goes through this city of walls that she's ended up with. And I think it's important that she describes it as a city of walls, because it's like there aren't doors. Things, because she's an Imagery, that there aren't, doors aren't open to her. She just feels like there are walls everywhere, and she feels trapped. And then there's this interesting thing where it says basically that city like almost attacks her, and they circle her and they accuse her of being dark in their free city. Now, dark, it might be talking about mood and feeling depressed and sad about what's happened in our own country. It also could be a reference to skin colour. And she talks about her city hides behind her, like that it's part of her past almost. It's something that she needs to protect. I don't know if there's anything else I'd massively want to say about that. I do think it's probably important that she doesn't ever mention which country it is, and the whole point is it's supposed to represent immigrants, period. It's not supposed to be specifically about one type of immigrant. Then we've got checking out my history. This one is essentially about the fact that John Agar rightly, I think, feels that black people particularly are not represented fairly in the history that we look at. Like if you think about the famous painters that you probably think Picasso or something like that. If you think about famous composers, that they're all white, and it's partly because of the education system. And he basically says that he feels that sometimes that we don't get taught properly history because it's written from a white perspective, and he wants to celebrate black culture regardless of what we do in history. He's saying, so I'm going to check out my own history, I'm going to look at my own history, I'm not just going to be told what they want. So one of the things that's important is the dialect in which he writes, because what he's saying is, I'm going to write in my own dialect. I don't have to be conforming to your kind of formal British or English dialect. So I'm going to write as I want. So that in itself might be seen as a bit of a protest, and obviously it's a protest poem. The fact that he, again, doesn't use any punctuation, this kind of free form. He's saying, I'm going to write however I want to. I don't have to conform to these lessons and these kind of formal rules of poetry. And it's very sing-songy. We get a sense when he says about them tell me about 1066 and all that, them tell me about Dick Whittington and his cat. This idea that it's almost this nursery rhyme, playful tone, and it's he's kind of saying, these are the things that are embedded in your very culture. You have nursery rhymes, you have young children's stories about that, and yet you don't talk about any of the really important things. And if you look about the language that's used to describe some of the black people in there, he talks about people being the first. He talks about them dreams. He talks about hope and struggle and freedom. He talks about Mary Seacole. He says from Jamaica she travelled far to the Crimean War, which is how he would say it, and clearly sounds stupid when I say it. She volunteered to go even when the British said no. She still braved the Russian snow, healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. This beautiful imagery of her being like a sunrise, hope, a new day, yellow symbolising warmth, and some people used to believe that when a new day rose that it was kind of like representative of God, bringing new life. And again, this sense of healing star, and it's notably he refers to her as both sunrise and a star, because actually they're the same thing, but this idea that it's something you look to, and obviously there's quite religious imagery there. So this really beautiful sense of celebrating black people, and also I think it's just important to notice that he says, them tell me. So he feels that them, the institutions, the people in power, because of course this is about lack of power, so I guess in some respects links to something like London, they are separate. So it's like in London, the people who own the chartered streets are separate from the mainstream people or the lower class people, and in this case the them, being the white institutions, are separate from the black people who don't get to hear about their own culture. And I think racial identity is important. He's Caribbean. Caribbean identity is important. He's saying my identity is important. I shouldn't be ashamed of it. I should embrace it, and that's why he writes in the dialect he does. He shows about this conflict between his Caribbean culture and his need to embrace his own identity, and he likens history and identity, and that is important. I do think that when you use words and phrases and when you think about the world, it's important that you consider your own identity in the history. That's why particular phrases are deemed to be offensive, because of the history behind them. It's important to understand history, and he believes that history is important. It informs who you are in the future and your identity. Okay, and I think finally, Kamikaze, is that the last poem? Yes, it is. Happy days. Okay, so Kamikaze. I really like Kamikaze as a poem, actually. Obviously, Kamikaze is... a kamikaze pilot was a person who was basically told to get on an aeroplane and go and fly into something and then die so that you could bomb an area. It's like a suicide mission. And in this poem, they're referring to a Japanese kamikaze pilot, and it would have been deemed that if you'd have done that, you'd have got like massive respect, and he goes off to do it. But then when he's flying, he has second thoughts, because he looks down and he just sees nature, and nature is beautiful. So if you get a question about the power of nature, you could absolutely talk about this poem, but it's not powerful in the same way that it might be in the prelude, because that's huge, peak black and huge. It's quite different imagery, but the power to change people's mind, the power to have an effect, the power to, I don't know, influence human behaviour, I think is absolutely there. So he's flying along, he's got one load of petrol, and then he looks down and he just sees this beautiful sea, and it reminds him of childhood, and he thinks, and you're not actually sure because it's told from the perspective of his granddaughter. Is it granddaughter? Yeah. Would have been, yeah, granddaughter. So she's saying, like, my mother used to say, and she imagined, so they imagine that he looked down and saw these beautiful fishing boats strung out like bunting. And it's important that with the simile that bunting is something that you have, like, it's something to do with celebration and occasions, and it's designed to make things look beautiful. And the fishing boats are like decorative. It's almost, they're shining out to give him a message of hope and celebration. And he looks down and he can't do it. He describes the fish as silver, this idea that they have value, that they're bright, that they're shining. And anyway, maybe he looked down and he remembered hanging out with his brothers and his father's fishing boat and the idea that family is important. But anyway, he comes back and he then it turns into italics, so you could talk about that in the structure. And it says, and although he came back, my mother never spoke to him again. And it's because there's this sense, so if you talk about the effects of conflict, if that's the question you get, that conflict can separate families, and obviously the obvious one to talk about then is Poppies. That there's a sense of lack of pride. She won't look at him in the eyes, and again, the eyes, the meeting of the souls, and really seeing into a human. And the neighbours also, they look at him with shame, and there's this sense that you should do your moral duty. And again, you could totally link that to exposure, and you could link that to Chargeable Light Brigade. The idea that if you're a coward, that's a bad thing. It's kind of natural to not want to die. It's kind of natural to love your family and nature. So, basically, he then he goes home, and they ignore him, and people treat him like he no longer existed, apart from the children, because of course the children don't have those prejudices because they haven't learned. But then in the last stanza, they do learn. They learn that actually he needs to be ostracised in their society. So they learn to be silent around him. And the idea that they can't love a man. They say this was no longer the father we loved, that they can't love a man who is alive. They can't love a man who, in war, decided to put himself and his family first, and was so awed by the beauty of nature that he wanted to live, that they somehow can't respect that. And essentially, if you talk about the effects of war and you talk about death, he has a metaphorical death, because although he doesn't actually die, he's left wondering what would have been the better way to die, because he does die metaphorically, because his family abandoned him, and his family is supposed to obviously represent life and love there. That is finally all, thank the Lord. Right, just so you know, all the comments and stuff, I don't get to see those afterwards. So if you've got a question to me, give me a tweet. It's probably the best way to do it. You can do it on YouTube, but I look at that less. So give me a tweet and I will ask it. If you're asking which poem you should do, essentially, I don't know until you see the question. So what you need to do is consider, what poem have I got in front of me? What would I bullet point down to answer the question? And then if I was going to do that, what obvious one could I relate it to? I just realised Saucy, chill out. Chill your boots. This is a very annoyed dog. I'm going to go now, and yeah, cheerio. Bye. Good luck, everyone, with your exams tomorrow. I really hope that they go well.